Hello and welcome back to the Boxing Index podcast. This is obviously in association with the boxingindex.co.uk. In case you missed it last week, as I mentioned in episode 1, this is a more casual forum for discussions around boxing, some more opinionated pieces and reviewing boxing cards, and then hopefully in the future my friend Rob will be doing some visuals, some more visual content for the latest boxing news. And it's just as opposed to the more formal arena of the website with the interviews and the articles. On today's episode, I'll be discussing the potential matchups from the stables of Eddie Hearn's Matchroom Boxing and Frank Warrens Queensbury Promotions, who obviously historically have not got along and not worked together. But since Fury beat Wilder, especially throughout this whole period of quarantine with people looking to sort of fast-track boxing and not wait around for the big fights, there's been a lot of talk about the Anthony Joshua-Tyson Fury fight. Obviously for the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. Two British fighters, like you can obviously see the appeal, but it comes with a lot of stipulations, including rival broadcasters, promoters, getting Wilder and Pulev to step aside, and obviously Fury said yesterday that he didn't want to pay Wilder to step aside, so that could cause problems. But for the sake of this podcast, we're going to assume that it will be made, which would, I guess, set a precedent for Matchroom and Queensbury Promotions to start working together more often and potentially create some great clashes in the future, especially on the British scene. And at the moment especially, that might be their only option, considering that we could see some travel restrictions due to the whole coronavirus situation in the future. Some more British clashes are going to have to be made, and obviously as the two biggest promoters in Britain, they may have to work together. So yeah, assuming that's that precedent set, today I'm going to talk about 5 potential exciting matchups that could be made between the two promotions. This was sort of off the top of my head, so if you think of any better ones, leave them in the comments below, and if there are any good ones, I'll discuss them on a future podcast. Right, so to start, at number 5, I've put Joe Joyce versus Dillian Whyte, and while that might seem like a strange one to have at number 5, because obviously that would be a great fight, I've mainly put it at number 5 because it's pretty unlikely to happen in the near future. There's not really been any talk of it. I've never seen either of them call each other out. It's not really been a fight that's being considered, I don't think. Maybe at some point, if Joe Joyce loses Daniel Dubois and Dillian Whyte fails at a world title attempt, it could be a good British clash to make. And obviously, as I mentioned before, with the travel restrictions, that could be a good one to make. It would be an absolute war. Both men have power. They don't stop coming forward. They can take a punch. I reckon it could be reminiscent of Whyte Chisora 1 in terms of like the style that the fight takes. Whyte would win it, in my opinion. He's just got the better resume, which you can't really argue with. Joe Joyce isn't that experienced in the pros. Obviously had a great amateur career. But yeah, I just think that would be a great fight, but obviously an unlikely one. Coming in at number 4, I've got Sonny Edwards against Cal Yafai, which would almost be like a changing of the guard fight, I guess. You get these sort of generational fights every once in a while where you get the older guy who's coming towards the end of his career fighting the up-and-coming guy, and then I guess normally the younger guy will sort of take the mantle or show that he's not quite ready yet. I think that would be that kind of fight. Obviously, Cal Yafai may be looking to move up in weight after the Gonzalez loss, and obviously I know that he's been known to sort of be struggling with the making the super flyweight. So that could obviously cause problems for it, but he could have one last fight at super flyweight, and I think a domestic clash with Edwards could be a good option, especially with obviously the aforementioned coronavirus travel restrictions. I think Edwards looks a really exciting fighter in terms of his style. He's got that flair, which is kind of the opposite to Cal, who is just very solid in all his departments. He's very technically sound, but he does everything by the book. And I think he'd be a good test to see where Sonny Edwards is at this stage of his career. For Cal, I think the best option is to go up in weight and try and win a world title and then get the best fights possible at bantamweight. He'll be 31 by the time that this lockdown's over and by the time he manages to get back in the ring, which is quite old for the lighter weights. But I guess Cal hasn't been in that many hard fights, so he may still have a few miles on the clock. Obviously, apart from the Roman Gonzalez KO, but I don't think there was much that Cal could have done that night. It was honestly one of the best performances I've seen. Roman Gonzalez, it was genuinely almost like poetry in motion. He absolutely schooled him. He seemed to just flow from one position to another, finding angles to get his punches off. And I I don't think there's many people in the world that could have beaten him that night, if any. So yeah, I think Cal will just sort of want to earn as much money as he can before retirement now. And he's achieved what he needs to by winning a world title, so I don't think he really gains much by fighting Sonny Edwards. You have to feel a bit sorry for Edwards because he doesn't seem to be getting any fights, because I think he said that he wants to, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he said that he wants to win the Lonsdale belt outright so that he gets to keep it, which obviously as per the British Board of Boxing Control rules, he then has to defend it 3 more times. And I think one of them has to be against a mandatory challenger, but the problem is finding British opponents will be tough for him because I don't think anyone really wants to fight him. Luckily, he's got age on his side, and I think he's got an exciting career ahead of him, especially with guys like Inoue and Roman Gonzalez making the lighter weights more popular than ever. In terms of the Cal Edwards fight, I think it's a tough one to call. I think the obvious choice would be Cal because of his experience, but obviously we don't know how good Edwards is at this point until he's tested, and Cal looks to be struggling at super flyweight, so I think it's a good 50-50 fight, but if I had to choose, I'd probably edge Cal. Coming in at number 3, I've got the Liam Williams versus Demetrius Andrade fight. It's obviously been a lot more publicised than the other 2 fights I've got on the list. But Williams looks like a completely new man at middleweight. He's got a renewed confidence. He seems to have an extra power as well. He's been knocking guys out. He's stringing together some great wins, especially that last one against Alantes Fox. I think he definitely deserves a world title shot by this point. He's ranked 2 by the WBO at the moment, so that's probably the route he's going, and obviously the champion is Andrade, but obviously Jaime Munguia is ranked at number 1, so he could be in the way. There's been a bit of talk about this one over social media, and I just think it could be an exciting fight. Andrade is kind of one of those guys, a bit like Billy Joe Saunders, who's sort of been avoided in the middleweight division because he's got a bit of a tricky style that not many people want to come up against. And I don't think Liam Williams is the high-profile fight that he's been crying out for, but I do think it's a good test. If you compare their performances against Alantes Fox, which, as I mentioned, was Williams' last fight, Andrade won it comfortably on the cards, but he was taken all the way and he was knocked down in the 7th, whereas if you watch the Williams-Alantes Fox fight, he brushed him aside easily, knocking him down in the 4th, again in the 5th, before getting him out of there later in the 5th. So I think it could be an interesting style matchup, sort of a brains versus brawn, which is quite a typical style matchup in boxing. My personal boxing preference is always brains, so I'd expect Andrade to win, but it'd be great to see Williams win a world title over in America and bring a big Welsh crowd with him. But I do think Andrade has the edge, but it's definitely winnable for Williams, and he definitely won't be a pushover. In at number 2, this is probably my favourite fight on the list, not because I think it's better than my number 1 pick, but just because I think it's a bit of a hidden gem between the 2 stables, is Hrgovic versus Dubois. It might not be a hidden gem, people might have been talking about it loads, but for the sake of this podcast, just humour me. Hrgovic and Dubois, they're both considered the 2 young gun, up-and-coming future stars of the heavyweight division, even though Hrgovic is actually 5 years older than Dubois, which came as a bit of a surprise to me. I thought he was a bit younger than that, but he's still relatively young for the heavyweight division at 27. Both of these men have smashed themselves into relevancy, knocking out almost everyone they've come across. Strangely, they actually share one of the only guys that neither of them has been able to knock out has been Kevin Johnson, but I guess he's known for being quite difficult to get rid of. Hrgovic obviously has less pro fights than Dubois, but he has a decorated amateur career with an Olympic bronze and a European gold. Dubois was meant to box for Team GB at Tokyo 2020, but opted to turn pro very young, which I guess now is looking like a wise decision with the delay of the Olympics. I know I've said it a few times in this podcast already, but this would be an absolute war. I can't see it going past the halfway mark with their 2 styles. It'd be a great fight to occupy and test both men while the sort of hierarchy at the top of the heavyweight division is sorted out with, because it's a bit of a mess between Joshua, Fury, Wilder, White. So while they're sorting all that out, it could be a good fight for both of these 2 to earn a bit of money before they're ready to sort of step up to the elite level. And then whoever does step up, I guess, will be sort of taking the throne for the next generation afterwards. Obviously, Dubois has got to get Joyce out of the way first, which isn't guaranteed. And being so young, I guess Frank Warren might be a bit wary of throwing him into too many tough fights too early. But as they say, to be the best, you've got to beat the best. I personally see Dubois winning for no other reason than he's just looked unstoppable so far, and probably a bit of British bias. But realistically, this is as close to a 50-50 as it gets, so I guess it just depends on who lands the first telling punch. Coming in at number 1, and my top pick, is Joshua Buatsi against Anthony Yarde. This is probably an obvious choice, but I guess it's obvious for a reason. It's one of those fights where these two just have to meet at some point. It's been talked about for a while. They're almost on a collision course. Again, it's a great clash of styles. They're both sort of calculated power punchers, so we should see a knockout. Yarde's obviously a few years ahead of Buatsi experience-wise, and having already had a world title shot against Kovalev in Russia, and he almost even knocked out Kovalev in the 8th round, I think it was the 8th round, before obviously running out of steam a bit. I would say Buatsi has the natural talent advantage, but obviously that hasn't been tested yet. He hasn't even been taken far enough in his fights to run out of steam, like we saw with the Yarde and Kovalev fight. I don't think Buatsi's even ever been past the 7th. But I do think Buatsi he seems to have that star power around him. I think he could act as the next AJ for British boxing in terms of becoming like a worldwide superstar. He's got good amateur pedigree with bronze at the Olympics and the Europeans, and he's been knocking people out with similar venom to a young AJ. So I think they could be on similar paths. And obviously he's backed massively by Eddie Hearn and Matchroom Boxing, which can be a very powerful promotional unit when they want to be, in terms of propelling someone into global recognition. I think he's stalled a little bit recently in terms of his career. He hasn't fought since October last year. I think he was meant to fight in November, but he had to pull out of the fight with illness, and then again he was supposed to return in March, just gone. But coronavirus has obviously scuppered that. But he was an absolute steamroller before that. I don't know if he'd want to jump straight in with Anthony Yarde, coming back after a bit of a layoff, but obviously with, as I mentioned a few times, with all the travel restrictions, like British clashes may become the thing to do, and that could be a great one. Also, they're obviously in the light heavyweight division, which is absolutely booming at the moment. I mentioned in the last podcast that the light heavyweight division is one of my favourites in the whole of boxing. There's just some huge names in there. Like you've got Bivol, Beterbiev. Also, I don't know actually if I'm pronouncing that right. I've heard so many people pronounce it in different ways. Beterbiev, Beterbiev, Beterbiev. I don't even know how to pronounce it, but we're going to go for Beterbiev. And obviously Gvozdzik as well. And so there could be some huge fights down the line in terms of world title fights, unifications. And I think Buatsi and Yarde are going to be right in the mix there. Yarde's obviously shown that he can be in the mix with that fight against Kovalev. He was definitely competitive. But I think that the fight with Buatsi should maybe happen before either of them have solidified themselves at world level to sort of test the waters. I think it'd be a great clash for British fans, and I guess it only gets bigger if you wait, but then you run the risk of it losing traction, or it becomes harder to make because there's more people involved with commissions, purse split issues, just all of that, what happens whenever a fight gets bigger. But I think whenever this fight does happen, it'll be great, and for me, I'd probably have to favour Buatsi. So those are my 5 top picks. I've also got a few that just missed out, sort of honourable mentions. One of them is Jack Catterall versus Lewis Ritson, which I think could almost act as a Josh Taylor eliminator sort of thing. Obviously Jack Catterall's looking for a step up in level. He's beaten most of the decent British level fighters like McKenna, Joe Hughes, Ahara Davies, and then Ritson's had that step up to European level. Obviously lost out there, but he had a good win in his last fight out against Robbie Davies Jr. They're both on the edge of a world title shot at the moment. It would be probably a bit more of a risky fight for Catterall because he's ranked number 1 by the WBO, and obviously if he loses, he'll lose his position. So he could just wait out for a chance at that title. But obviously, yeah, as with the travel restrictions I've been talking about, I think that's a good domestic clash. I think it could be in Newcastle, have a great atmosphere at Newcastle Arena. Probably a good payday for both men as well. I can't personally see either men beating the belt holders in the division, Ramirez or Taylor. Obviously, Ritson's lost at European level. Catterall struggled with Ahara Davies, didn't look good. And then obviously Taylor dispatched him emphatically, making him quit. I think they're slightly unfortunate in that the super lightweight division is just such a good division at the moment. You've got, even below the 2 belt holders, you've got Prograis, you've got Hooker, you've got Baranchik, you've got Postal. But I think it would be good it'll be a good chance if Taylor did fight the winner to bring Taylor back to the UK, because presumably being with Top Rank, he'll be fighting mostly in the US. So it'll be a good chance for the UK fans to get to see him, and it'd be an opportunity for a well-deserved title fight for Catterall or Ritson, whoever wins it, provided obviously Taylor brings the belts back from America. But I think it's not really a fight that would appeal to Taylor, because unless it somehow becomes mandatory, he's unlikely to want to take it, because it's sort of that situation of little money, little reward, because I guess Ritson's got quite a big fan base in Newcastle, but Catterall hasn't really got that much draw. And obviously Taylor wants to be taking those big fights, as I don't know how much. I think he said he wants to be in for maybe 6 more fights. And then obviously it's got the caveat of Scotland versus England rivalry, which adds sort of another aspect to it. But yeah, I think Taylor beats both men. In terms of who I think wins between Catterall and Ritson, I'd probably have to favour Catterall. But again, I think it's a good 50-50 fight. And then finally, the only other one I had that just missed out was Liam Williams against Felix Cash. I know I've obviously mentioned Liam Williams, Andrade. This was more if travel restrictions do come into play. By the way, I'm pretty sure I've been pronouncing that Demetrius Andrade wrong this whole podcast. I think it's actually Demetrius Andrade, but you just have to let me have that one. I hope it didn't annoy you too much over the podcast. So getting back into it, I think it's a good domestic clash. Obviously, Williams deserves a title shot, so this wouldn't be what he's hoping for. But there's not a particularly rich pool of middleweights in Britain at the moment, because obviously Chris Eubank and Billy Joe Saunders have moved up in weight. But Williams, Cash, they're both the same age. It'd be a good test of level for Felix Cash, because he's coming off a good win against Jack Cullen, but he hasn't really been tested yet. And if you go off the Cash versus Cullen fight, which was obviously one of the fights of the year, then I think this could be another great punch-up, because they're both power punchers. They both come on the front foot. Yeah, obviously I'd have to edge Williams in this, but yeah, I think it could be another great fight between the two stables. So I think that's all for today. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll be back next week with another podcast. And if there's anything you'd like us to discuss, please leave it in the comments. As I said last week, hopefully I'll be getting guests on soon when we're out of lockdown. But for now, go check out our website, boxingindex.co.uk. We've got some good new articles coming over the weekend. We've got an interview with MTK Global's Lee Eaton, and another one with Queensbury Promotions' new signing, Amin Jahanzeb. Also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Boxing Index. Go give our Facebook page a like. I think we're nearing 500 likes now, so if you could go push us there, that'd be great. And once again, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.